The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents The Bible Doesn't Say That. So in the course of having conversations with theists, lots of discussions center around the Bible. What does the Bible say? What does the Bible mean? How do we interpret this? Oh, this is a contradiction. I've spoken before about the problems of exaggerating the claims that we're making. And I see this all the time, and I'm guilty of it as well. Recently, I heard someone say the Bible has nothing to say in opposition to incest, and they bring up Lot and his daughters and other examples like that. That's an exaggeration. In fact, the Bible does condemn incest in Leviticus 18:4 and a number of other verses. I've also heard people talk about you can just, if you want to get married, you can just rape someone because you're required to marry your rape victim. I've said this myself in the past. There's a problem with this particular claim in that it is a bit one-sided, and I'll get to the specifics of each of these in just a little bit. The bigger point is that when we talk about these things, we want to make sure that we are fairly and accurately representing what the book says, what the book was intended to mean to the extent that we can know that, what Christians and theists, if we're talking about other holy books, take that passage to mean, and to make sure that the objections that we're making are sound, that we're finding the best targets to object to. Quite often I see us making objections to things that when I was a fundamentalist Southern Baptist Christian wouldn't have impacted me in any way, because we know that there are scribal errors. We know that some of these things don't seem to make sense. We may not have explanations and understanding for all of them, but God is there to sort through it, and it's a matter of trust. And my salvation as a Christian was not dependent on whether or not the Bible says pi equals 3. So I mentioned taking a look at what the Bible actually says versus what it's intended to mean versus what believers take from it. So the Bible may say, bring my enemies before me and let me slaughter them. And it literally says this in the modern English translations. What was the passage intended to mean? What context is there? Is this in fact a parable? These are questions that we have to ask. But we also have to ask, how has this been traditionally viewed? Because while it may say, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, if the bulk of Christians view that as sort of an advice to stay away from people who are engaged in witchcraft and not an actual order to kill witches, we have to take that into consideration. Once upon a time during the Salem witch trials, it might have been worthwhile to launch an objection to thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. In modern times, it really doesn't have that much impact. During the entire time that I was a believer, never once would it have occurred to me to get together all my friends and stone a witch, even though that's specifically in the Bible. And that's the point that perhaps you should be objecting to. Not so much that the Bible has a literal declaration to kill witches, but that people aren't following it. Isn't this a bit hypocritical? How did they come to the conclusion? How did they reach this determination that it says this, but they don't have to follow it, or something has changed? So there's going to be a conflict between quite often Old Testament and New Testament passages, where some people just say, well, that's the Old Testament, and they want to shrug off the entire Old Testament. It's important to point out that you don't get to shrug off the entire Old Testament and keep the New. You can't have the New without the Old. You don't have any prophecies that for Jesus to purportedly fulfill. You don't have the Ten Commandments. You don't have the various instructions. So if they want to just throw out parts of the Old Testament, they need to talk about what mechanism they use to determine which parts should go away. Quite often, the charge will come from Christians to say, well, you're taking that verse out of context. When we talk about Exodus 21 and its advocation for slavery, oh, well, you're taking those verses out of context. Okay, fine. Instead of just saying, no, I'm not, perhaps it's a good idea to say, okay, what is the context? In what context is it a good idea to enslave people and make them your property that you can pass on to your kids? In what context is it a good idea, or is it okay to beat people as long as they don't die within a couple of days? I talked about a few examples earlier, and I'm going to give some specifics about that. The Bible does, in fact, condemn incest, as I talked about in Leviticus 18:4, which, basically talks about if you sleep with someone who's too close in kin to you, that's against the rules. But that passage doesn't really do a good job of defining what too close in kin means. I mean, is it just like brothers and sisters? Is it, how does this count? Well, if you read other verses, the Bible specifically goes through and tells you who in your family you should and shouldn't sleep with. I mean, it's spelled out, and it's weirdly specific. You know, you're not to sleep with your father's wife, whether or not that's your mother or not. Perhaps we're looking back at old times where he might have had many wives, and only one of them might have been your mother. But if the Bible's going to go through and spell out the individual cases of who you should and shouldn't sleep with, then it seems to me that instead of saying something incorrect, like the Bible does not prohibit incest, instead we should talk about the specific cases of incest that the Bible prohibits and the ones that it seems to implicitly be okay with. Because if you go to all the trouble to say, don't sleep with your sister, don't sleep with your first cousin, don't sleep with your father's wife. Wait a minute, does that mean I can sleep with my second cousin? Is that where it becomes okay? Is that where we've drawn the line? These sorts of questions are the ones that we should be asking. When we talk about what the Bible literally says versus what it's intended to mean, we may not be able to figure out what it was intended to mean. We don't have the original authors to talk to. So the investigation becomes a search through context in other passages of the Bible. And there's some important things to know about how we should view things and how Christians have traditionally viewed things. So how do we go about figuring out what a passage was originally intended to mean? We may not have any way of sorting this out. The Bible's a collection of 66 books written by different authors over a rather large span of time, and they may not all have had the same intent. But there's a number of things to consider. One is that a general rule, like thou shalt not kill, can be overridden by a more specific instruction, go out and slay all the Midianites, without necessarily being a contradiction. A contradiction is when two conflicting instructions are given ostensibly to the same people at the same time in the same scenario, as if they were supposed to both apply in the same way at the same time. Those sorts of instructions where a specific is overriding a general are fairly common. I remember a debate once where the debater pointed out that the instructions to Noah were contradictory, because in one chapter God's telling him to go get 2 of every animal, and in another chapter he's telling him to get 7. And a Christian stood up during the Q&A to point out that this isn't a contradiction at all. In fact, the second one's a clarification, that it's just much easier to say, go get me 2 of everything, but also get me 7 of these. And it's just like if I sent you to the grocery store or the convenience store and said, get me 2 of every candy bar, but get me 7 of every candy bar that has nuts. That's not a contradiction. And when the instructions are coming that close together, it's clear that I'm offering a clarification. The other thing to consider is that older instructions can be overturned and overruled by newer instructions. The time span in which the Bible was written means that there may have been some instruction early on that was applicable then that has changed. Is that the case? Well, I don't know. It's up to the believers who think that there's a new instruction that overrides it to actually make the case for this. This is where we get into discussions about context. You're taking it out of context. The best thing to do is to ask them, what is the context? Can you explain to me the specifics that you're talking about that allow you to interpret the passage this way? This matter of interpretation comes up over and over and over again. Oh, that's just your interpretation. That's just your interpretation. The truth is, it's pretty much all interpretation. There are a handful of passages that are very clearly seem to be intended to be read literally. There are others that are metaphorical. There are others that are generally instructional. There are some that are clearly written, codified set of laws. And there are others that are about the history and about the emotions of the people and about worship. And so, of course, it's going to be a matter of interpretation. The bigger question about interpretation is, how do we figure out whose is right? We may not be able to do that. So the best that we can do is ask, what is their justification for the interpretation that they're using? Why do they think it means this instead of something else? And what you recognize is that there's over 1,000 denominations that identify as Christian, and they disagree on pretty much every point of doctrine you can imagine. And so what one person in one church thinks this passage means, another person in another church might think it means something completely different. That is the point that you should object to, that this isn't clear. Instead of trying to get on this is what it actually means. I'm the atheist, I'm the godless heathen who is telling you what the passage actually means. If you do that, you better have really good grounds to back it up when you're talking about what the Bible clearly says about slavery, etc. But if you're talking about something that's much more prone to interpretation, it seems to me the better point of our argument is to point out that, yeah, that's their interpretation and somebody else has a different one and somebody else has a different one. How can we tell which one, if any of them, are correct? So one of the takeaways from all this is you don't have to be an expert on the Bible. In fact, pretty much no believer is an expert in the Bible. I was a believer, fundamentalist, literalist, Southern Baptist Christian for more than 25 years. I've been hosting the Atheist Experience show for 10. I've been doing lectures and debates. I've talked about the Bible. I have some expertise in the area. I've studied it in detail, and I am not a Bible expert or a Bible scholar. I know enough. I know enough to engage in the topic, and what I also know is how to go about doing research here. There are a number of great resources on the internet. Probably the most common and most popular is skepticsannotatedbible.com. And you can go through there and you can find where the Bible is saying atrocious things and encouraging atrocities, and here's a potential contradiction, and here's something that's anti-science, and it categorizes them, and it is great stuff. But don't think that everything that's listed as perhaps a contradiction on there or an accurate interpretation of what the Bible means applies to every believer, or in fact any believer. There are other resources like ironchariots.org, infidels.org. If you search through the library at infidels.org, you'll find a big long list of contradictions in the Bible. Contradictions, absurdities, and atrocities, a bunch of those. And they're great resources, but they're not all contradictions. I'm sure many of you have seen the chart that was popular for a while that had red arcs connecting verses all across the Bible to show what contradicted what. Some of them are contradictions, some of them aren't, and it depends on what people have to say and what people believe about those passages. So the best way, you don't have to be a Bible scholar, you don't have to be an expert in doctrines of different religious traditions. What you really want to do is be an expert in asking questions and getting them to defend their position rather than just asserting that their position is wrong. If in fact their position is wrong and you can demonstrate it, by all means do that. But what I find is the best thing, start with those resources like Skeptics Annotated Bible, infidels.org, ironchariots.org, the list of contradictions. Take a look at them and then say, okay, this seems like it would be a really good argument. Now let me go out and see if there are any Christian apologists who have already addressed this. Maybe this is a misunderstanding. Maybe there's a common apologetic that already details what's wrong with this particular interpretation that we're trying to cite. Maybe I'm getting ready to walk into a trap and I didn't even know it. If I just blurt out that the Bible doesn't, is never in opposition to incest and Lot slept with his daughters, or you have to marry your rapist. Well, that passage about a rapist having to marry his victim doesn't address the entire scenario, because she doesn't have to marry him. The Bible is very clear that women are property, and the rapist has defiled her father's property. She belongs to her father in that sense, and that is why he's obligated to marry her and cannot divorce her. But it doesn't say that she's obligated to marry him, and it doesn't say that she can't divorce him. That choice is made not by her, but her father. That to me seems like the strongest point to object to. Don't run around saying, oh, if you want to find yourself a wife, as I've said in the past, just go ahead and rape somebody because then you have to marry him. Because modern Christians will say, well, no, it's up to her father. And do you think any father is going to make their daughter marry their rapist? Well, perhaps modern fathers wouldn't, but I don't know that we can say that for everyone at all times. But the bigger problem is that the decision is the father's. The woman has no say in it. There's no talk about if a man is raped by a man. There's no talk about if a man is raped by a woman. It's all about women as property. You've defiled my property, and now you must purchase it, pay the bride price. Finding the better target to go after is the smart move. Picking out the contradictions, the things in the Bible that seem atrocious, is a great start. The next step is to go find out what Christians and apologists are saying about this, how they've tried to reconcile it, and find the flaws in those arguments. Or, if there aren't any flaws, accept them. That's what the reasonable person does. It may be that we've just launched an incredibly bad objection, that the Bible doesn't in any way say or mean what we think it says or means. I remember when Sam Harris put out a letter to Christian Nation and he wrote that the Bible says pi equals 3. No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. It describes a well that's 10 cubits across and 30 cubits round. You have to remember, you're talking about a period of time where people were measuring the distance from their elbow to the tips of their fingers. Nobody was making a pronouncement about a mathematical constant or property. They were just describing a well. Yes, it's written that it's exactly 30 around, but lots of apologists have talked about potentially curved wells or wells with a ring around it so that you get these different dimensions. But the big thing is that nobody's salvation was in any way based on whether or not the Bible correctly determined the value of pi or how it described this well. It's something that I don't think has ever been taught in a church prior to Sam Harris raising it. I might be wrong. There's been a lot of churches and a lot of sermons, but I don't think that's the case. Picking out the best targets to go after and making sure that if we're going to make claims about what the book says and what it means, that we are either consistent with what the individual Christian or believer that we're talking to believes, or that we are consistent with what some other Christian group or believers believe so that we can point out the contradiction between them, or that we are open to saying, this appears to be a contradiction to me. This appears to be a problem to me. How do you reconcile this? Why is it that you're not objecting to the Bible endorsing slavery? Why is it that you're not objecting to fathers determining whether or not their daughters should be marrying their rapists? These are the types of arguments that make people think. They're question-based. They don't have us sitting in pronouncement and judgment over a particular interpretation of the Bible. This habit that a lot of people have of exaggerating and overreaching is understandable. It begins with, I know that I'm right and I know that you're wrong, and I may not know exactly why or how you're wrong, but it is. And so it's probably better for me just to, maybe go the extra step, and then if you call me on it, well, okay, maybe I exaggerated a little bit, but there's still a big problem here. Why go through all that? Why not just find the big problem to begin with? Why not do a little extra homework, talk to some believers, find out what different people are saying, find the weakest point of attack, the one that is undeniable, the one that they're not going to just shrug off as context, the one that is actually consistent with what they believe, whether it matches what you think the Bible says or what the Bible says or what someone else thinks the Bible says or not. That's how you get people to recognize problem with the Bible. The rest of it's just yelling.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.